What's up, everybody? Welcome back to the Martian MMA podcast. I am your host. My name is John, and welcome back to episode 106, where we will be analyzing and predicting the UFC Fight Night headlined by Deiveson Figueiredo versus Joseph Benavidez, going down this Saturday, July 18, 2020, from Fight Island, Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates. This card will start at 5 p.m. Eastern Time and feature 12 fights across ESPN Plus and the ESPN TV channel. This is, of course, the third Martian MMA podcast within about 8 days' time, so thank you for everyone who has been tuning into these podcasts. We got a busy UFC week with 3 cards in 1 week. We are going to be breaking down all 12 fights betting lines here shortly, but on a quick betting note, I want to say that I track all of my official bets on betmma.tips. It's the premier platform for tracking MMA plays, and in the year 2020 alone, I am up over 40 units on track bets, so it's been a great 2020. Have been doing good with the fight predictions, doing great with the bets, and I'm giving out a lot of free bets on the podcast, so make sure you're paying attention and make sure you check out my official bets on the Bet MMA tips page. It can be found on my Twitter, my YouTube description, or on the Bet MMA Tips website. My name on there is Martian MMA. So with that being said, we're going to get into these 12 fights taking place from Abu Dhabi this Saturday. It's tomorrow, about 24 hours till the first fight starts. All fighters did make weight, so we got 12 official matchups going down in less than 24 hours. We're going to start things off in the heavyweight division. We have Sergey Spivak taking on Carlos Felipe. The opening betting line for this fight was Felipe minus 130 to Spivak plus 110. Right now the line has flipped. We are now seeing Spivak minus 175 to Felipe plus 155. So congratulations to anybody who got in on Spivak at plus money. That was a great bet. I actually bet him at minus 134 and he's all the way down to minus 175 now. So it goes without saying that I am favoring Sergey Spivak in this fight. It is Carlos Felipe's UFC debut, and he only has 2 available fights online, and in one of them was from about 5 years ago. He had a very low-level opponent. He was throwing sloppy arm punches without much power and still managed to get cage pushed. Just looked extremely sloppy in all aspects of MMA. He stuffed a few takedowns in round 3 versus a gassed out Maya, but I do not take much from that at all. And it just seems like he has poor technique. He doesn't look in good physical shape. And the biggest red flag of all is he has not fought pro MMA since May of 2017. So he's coming in here off of over 3 years off. I really don't understand how the UFC even found this guy, but getting over to Spivak, he's shown some decent striking technique, and he's really shown an ability to hit takedowns. He showed that in the Tai Tuivasa fight. He attempted a lot of takedowns in that fight. Didn't have the greatest top control, but eventually did tire Tai Tuivasa out and get the submission in round 2. So Spivak shows that he can go from takedowns, and I think that that would be a great game plan here. The way that Felipe got pushed against the cage and just how bad he looks in physical shape, I think that Spivak has a great chance of taking him down. I think Spivak is the better athlete. He's the better well-rounded fighter, and he certainly has beaten the better competition than Felipe has. So not too much analysis needs to be put in this one. I favor Spivak. I bet him at minus 134. Where it's at now, minus 175, I'd probably say it's a pass at this line because it's heavyweight and a lot of random high variance stuff could happen, so I would pass where it's at now, but I see no value on Felipe. I think he probably gets taken down here. Even if it stays in the feet, I favor Spivak to outstrike Felipe and to win this fight either by knockout, submission, or decision. So the pick is going to be Sergey Spivak to win by submission in round 2. The next fight takes place in the lightweight division. We have Arman Tsarukyan taking on Ramos. The opening betting line for this one was Tsarukyan minus 230 to Ramos plus 195. Right now we are seeing Tsarukyan minus 195 to Ramos plus 180. So a little bit of action coming in on Ramos here. And I understand why. I think that at the price where it's at now, I think there is a little bit of value on Ramos here. But I wouldn't go too crazy betting on Ramos because ultimately I do think he loses this fight. But there are going to be a lot of times where if you are betting on Tsarukyan at minus 200, I think that it's going to look like a bad bet. You might even regret it at some points during this fight because I think Tsarukyan is a little bit of a liability on the feet. We have not seen that much striking from him. And in his last fight versus OAM, he ate some big left kicks, big left knees, and seemed to have a decent chin. He took the shots well and was still proceeding with his takedowns and shooting a lot of wrestling shots in that fight. But Tsarukyan definitely didn't look too comfortable on the feet. And Ramos is not the greatest striker either. He's very low volume, relies on power shots, but I think that he could keep Tsarukyan honest by launching a power punch or knee every now and then. And I don't think that Tsarukyan easily outstrikes Ramos at all. It's actually a very even 50-50 matchup on the feet. Now, Tsarukyan attempts a lot of takedowns and likely shoots a lot versus Ramos, but Ramos is an ADCC champion. He's a tremendous jiu-jitsu player, and I don't think it's going to be really easy for Tsarukyan to take Ramos down, and it's certainly not going to be easy for him to hold Ramos down. And you might be looking back at Ramos' last fight versus Islam Makhachev. It was not a good performance. He threw almost no strikes on the feet in rounds 1 and 2, was outstruck easily. In round 3, he got dropped by a knee at the start of the round and spent about 4 minutes on his back. But he was not taken down in that fight, and we really have not seen Ramos taken down at all in the UFC. So it's hard to imagine Tsarukyan has an easy time taking him down, especially considering he didn't have an easy time taking OAM down last fight. I think OAM was able to stuff about 8 or 9 takedowns from Tsarukyan and only got taken down cleanly about 1 or 2 times. He got cage pushed a lot for round 1 and controlled against the cage. OAM stuffed shots and outstruck and won round 2 versus Tsarukyan, and then eventually Tsarukyan got a takedown and top control in round 3 to win a close decision. But that was not a really great performance from Tsarukyan at all. So I think people are jumping the gun a little bit on Tsarukyan. He has impressed me in his two UFC fights, but I still think he's a little too unproven to be betting here at minus 200, especially over a tough guy like Ramos, who I think is a tough stylistic matchup. He's going to be throwing power shots on the feet, keeping Tsarukyan honest. He's going to have decent takedown defense and ability to get off of his back if Tsarukyan attempts the takedown. So it's dog or pass. I think Ramos is worth about a half a unit, 1 unit bet at these plus 180, plus 175 odds, wherever it's been the past few days. I'm still going to lean with Tsarukyan by decision because I think he wins by cage pushing and by being the slightly more active and aggressive fighter. But it's definitely dog or pass, and I do not knock a small bet on Ramos at all. The next fight takes place in the flyweight division. We have Malcolm Gordon taking on Amir Albazi. The opening betting line for this one was Albazi minus 135 to Gordon plus 115. Right now we are seeing Albazi minus 165 to Gordon plus 155. So more action coming in on the favorite Albazi in this one. And I agree with that action. I think that Albazi is the right side to be on here. I think he's the much more well-rounded fighter, and he's definitely the better striker of the two. So I think that Gordon is going to need to get takedowns, need to get top position, and I don't think that he's reliable enough to do that. What I saw from Gordon on tape is that he gets rocked in the first 30 seconds of almost all of his fights. I think I counted 4 or 5 different fights where he was hurt by punches or knocked down or shooting bad shots right away in the first 30 seconds. So Gordon's defense on the feet is not good. His chin looks a little weak, and he does not check leg kicks. One of his most recent losses against Wardenberg was him just getting leg kicked over and over again, outstruck, and eventually got TKO'd by leg kicks and punches. And he wins most of his fights by taking his opponents down and out-grappling them. But I have not been impressed with his top game. I think he's fought in some pretty low-level competition, and I think Albazi has the better wins. And I think he's fought in the better competition. I've seen way better striking from Albazi, especially in prolonged striking exchanges. And I've seen in a good grappling game from Albazi as well. He's more of an offensive grappler than a defensive. He actually likes to hit his own takedowns. He has a good top game of his own. He did make some bad grappling IQ moves in round 3 of one of his fights. He went for a bad back take and ended on his back, and he even has a loss over Shorty Torres on his record, but I honestly thought he won that fight. I thought he won rounds 1 and 2 of that fight before making that dumb move in round 3 and getting stuck on his back. But Albazi has struggled getting off of his back in that Torres fight, so I think that you can't go too crazy on Albazi here because he might get taken down and might just not have the ability to get up. I might be underestimating Gordon's top game and maybe overestimating Albazi's overall MMA game. So I think Gordon needs takedowns to win. I don't think that he can outstrike Albazi, and I have not seen reliable enough offensive wrestling and top game from Gordon to think that he can win this fight. I've liked what I've seen from Albazi, his defensive grappling, his own offensive grappling. I think that he could be the one hitting takedowns here if he really wanted to, and he's definitely going to be hitting that leg kick. He's probably going to be outboxing Gordon, and I think that there's a good chance we see a finish from Albazi here just because of how fragile Gordon looks. So the pick for me is going to be Albazi by finish. I think he could get it done by knockout or submission. He also could win by decision. And I think the only real way that Gordon wins is by decision, by getting takedowns in top time and winning 2 out of 3 rounds. I don't think a submission is very likely from him. I just have not seen enough submissions or dominant top game from him. So I'm pretty confident in Albazi in this one. Minus 165. It still has some value left if you want to get in on there as well. I did bet Albazi at that price, and I think he gets the finish here. The next fight takes place in the bantamweight division. We have Brett Johns taking on Montel Jackson. The opening betting line for this one was Jackson the favorite at minus 162, Johns plus 140. Right now we are seeing Jackson minus 205 to Johns plus 188. There's definitely two-way action coming in on this fight. I know a lot of people betting Johns as an underdog, and I guess there are people still backing Jackson at minus 200 because the price stays going up and down. But I think that Johns is the clear value side in this one. I'm a bit concerned about the experience of Jackson. We all know that he's only been fighting MMA for about 3 or 4 years, but he's only had 4 fights in the UFC, and one fight he was taken down and out-grappled by Ricky Simone. He had a nice finish over Brian Kelleher, which is definitely his best win. And then he had 2 decision wins over Andre Sukumtat and Felipe Colares, where he looks good in those fights. He looked solid, improving, but neither of those guys are that great, and I think that we really haven't seen Jackson tested too much against really good fighters. Kelleher is good, but we just didn't get to see that fight play out long enough, and I mean, Jackson did hurt him with a punch and submit him, so he looked good though. I'm a bit concerned about the lack of top control from Jackson. He's definitely a wrestler and attempted about 20 takedowns in his last fight versus Colares, and he hit about 10 of those takedowns, but he did not really get any top time from those takedowns. Colares was pretty much bouncing right back up to his feet, and Jackson doesn't have a back take game. He doesn't have much of a submission game, and I think that he really lacks a top game. So he's going for all these takedowns using a ton of energy, but once he gets the opponents to the floor, he does not have great success out-grappling them, and that's going to be even harder against a great defensive grappler and scrambler like Brett Johns. Brett Johns' defensive grappling really impressed me versus Munoz and versus Aljamain Sterling. Even in his last fight against Gravely, his grappling looked solid. His back takes were there. He was reverse in position. He did get taken down and stuck on his back for a few minutes, but he eventually works his way back up to the feet, reverses, ends up on top, goes for his own submission. So I really like Brett Johns as a grappler. And on the feet in this one, I think it's really even. I think Jackson has a slight advantage in the striking because he's so long and has a great frame for the weight class, and his striking has been improving. We saw him unleash a lot of punches versus Colares. Not the most technical stuff. It looks like his defense still is a bit untested, but his offense is getting better. He's definitely not scared to let his hands go, and he has a good array of kicks and knees, elbows that he throws too. So Jackson's striking is no joke, despite him being pretty inexperienced in the striking. So I completely understand why Jackson is the favorite here. He is the slightly better striker and slightly better grappler, but I just don't think that you can be betting him at minus 200. I think he's just too unproven, and Brett Johns has a good enough stylistic matchup here where he could present a lot of problems for Jackson. I think it's relatively unknown who the better striker is here. I think either one could outstrike one another. And the same goes to the grappling. There's a lot up in the air about this fight. And I think that I favor Brett Johns to reverse position, to stand up, to drain out the energy from Jackson, make Jackson work hard for these takedowns. And I really like the Brett Johns goes for back takes. That's a huge factor in this fight, because if he's able to reverse position like Colares was a few times, that back take on Jackson is going to be a huge tool. Jackson, a wrestler, not too familiar with the jiu-jitsu positions yet this early into his career, and I think that we could see Johns potentially out-grapple Jackson here. So once again, I agree with Jackson being the favorite. I think that maybe minus 130, minus 150 range would be appropriate, but where the line is at now, I think it's clear dog or pass, and I'm actually going to pick Brett Johns to reverse position, stuff takedowns, land strikes in the feet, and grind out a decision, likely against the cage here versus Jackson. I think that he could even get a submission if we see a back take or a front choke position of some sort. So I like Brett Johns in this fight. I think he'll fight for your money at plus 190. I got one unit on him at that price, and I think there's still a lot of value left on plus 188. So the pick here is Johns by decision. Not the most confident pick because I do like Jackson. I think he's an improving fighter, and we could see him edge out a decision here. But for that plus 190, I'm happy to pick Johns by decision. The next fight takes place in the lightweight division. We have Joel Alvarez taking on Joe Duffy. The opening betting line for this one was Duffy minus 305 to Alvarez plus 225. Right now we are seeing Duffy minus 330 to Alvarez plus 270. So Honestly, I think this line is a bit crazy. I think that Joe Duffy, this much of a favorite after he's looked so mediocre in his past few fights, I don't think that there's any way you could trust Joe Duffy as a favorite here, especially at minus 300. I mean, Joel Alvarez is not a good fighter. I've been super unimpressed with what I've seen him from in the UFC. The most impressive thing he's done was not get finished by Damir Ismagulov. And I mean, he was taken down and pretty much dominated on the mat versus Danilo Belluardo in his last fight before he got a nice reversal in round 2 and just got a weird knockout. It was a crazy fight. I mean, he was getting completely dominated on the ground for 6 or 7 minutes and then gets one reversal and then finishes his opponent with ground and pound. So I think that there's a lot unproven about Alvarez. We don't really know how good he is. Most of his regional wins were submissions off of his back. So I don't think Alvarez is much of a striker, and he's pretty bad grappler too, because he was getting out grappled by Belluardo. So I do favor Duffy in this fight. I think minus 200 or something like that would be appropriate, but Duffy only has 2 fights in the past 3 or 4 years. One fight, he won round 1 versus James Vick, was looking good, but started to slow down, get calf kicked a lot, and eventually outstruck and knocked out in round 2. And then his fight versus Mark Diakese last March was just an awful performance. It looked like Duffy quit a few minutes into this fight. It looked like he realized the fight wasn't going his way and just provided real little resistance throughout the rest of the fight. He was shooting weak takedowns. He was getting stuffed. He was getting outstruck, leg kicked a lot. He ended up getting taken down himself and stuck on his back. So Duffy looked awful in his last fight. It was against Diakese, who's a much better fighter than Alvarez, but I think that Alvarez at plus 300 is worth a small bet, maybe 0.25 units or a half a unit. I think that the odds are wide enough to the point where even though Alvarez sucks, I think that a bet on him is warranted just because the odds are wide. So I'm still going to pick Duffy by decision in this one, but I think that Alvarez is the value side. It's definitely dog or pass. Avoid throwing Duffy in any parlays or anything like that. Maybe bet Duffy by decision if you want to, but I wouldn't bet this fight at all besides Alvarez money lines for very small. So the pick once again is Duffy by decision. The next fight is a 150-pound catchweight fight between Grant Dawson and Narimani. The opening betting line for this one was Dawson minus 260 to Narimani plus 220. We are now seeing Dawson minus 220 to Narimani plus 200. So there is two-way action coming in on this fight. I think the dog side in Narimani is a little more popular, and I agree with Narimani being the value side here. I think that Dawson is practically a one-dimensional fighter. His striking has looked very bad in his few UFC fights. It doesn't look like he's improving his striking at all, really. And I think that he pretty much only has takedowns in Top Game. And he is a very reliable wrestler. He shoots a lot of takedowns. He has a great Top Game. But he's fighting Narimani, who is a good defensive grappler. Stuffed some takedowns from Mike Grundy. Is not an easy guy to take down at all. Stuffed a lot of takedowns from Anderson Dos Santos, and I think that Narimani is clearly the better striker here. Narimani has some decent boxing, and just from what I've seen from Dawson's defense, especially in like the Trezano fight, he just does not react to punches well and kind of desperately shoots takedowns once he starts getting hit. So I don't think Dawson likes getting hit. I think that Narimani is the cleaner, better striker here and likely outstrikes and hurt Dawson whenever it's on the feet. So in my opinion, Dawson needs takedowns to win here, and I do think that he shoots a lot of takedowns. I think that he's very reliable to shoot those takedowns, but I think Narimani's defensive grappling, his takedown defense, could give him some problems. I think that there's a chance we see Narimani stuff takedowns, outstrike Dawson on the feet. He could win a decision by stuffing takedowns and outstriking Dawson for 3 rounds. He could possibly land a good punch and knock him out. This is not going to be an easy fight for Grant Dawson, and maybe I'm wrong about this one. Maybe he lands an early takedown and just dominates Narimani on the ground, and there's a huge grappling differential. But I don't think that that's going to be the case. I think that we likely see the striking exchanges won by Narimani, very close wrestling exchanges, and if it gets to the floor, I think that we might even see Narimani defend takedowns or defend the grappling attempts, get back up to his feet, reverse position, and Dawson was taken down and out-grappling Julian Erosa for multiple rounds, but was not able to get that submission. So I don't think it's guaranteed that Dawson gets an easy submission if he's able to get a takedown here. So I understand the dog action on Narimani here. I think he's definitely the rightful side. I'm still going to pick Grant Dawson to win by decision. I think that he likely just hits takedowns, has a lot of cage pushing time, and negates the damage that Narimani does on the feet by grappling. but I think that it's definitely dog or pass at these odds, and I would not knock a bet on Narimani at plus 200. The next fight takes place in the light heavyweight division. We have Khadis Ibragimov taking on Hermansson-Dolidze. The opening betting line for this one was Dolidze minus 170 to Ibragimov plus 155. Right now we are seeing Dolidze minus 147 to Ibragimov plus 137. So more action coming in on Ibragimov. It's actually been late action. The line was sitting right around where it opened for the past few weeks, but the past 24 hours we've seen a lot of action come in on Khadis Ibragimov. Personally, I don't get that late action. I think that Dolidze is the clear favorite in this one. I would actually favor him probably up until minus 200. Both of these guys are pretty inexperienced, and I think that we know what to expect from both of them. From Dolidze, you're going to be getting low output striking. He explodes with the occasional punch or two, doesn't really throw much volume on the feet, and typically looks to hit offensive takedowns and to outgrapple his opponents, but he has not really fought any decent defensive grapplers. I think Souza was the best defensive grappler he fought. Souza was able to stuff some takedowns. He did get pushed against the cage, and Dolidze landed some nice clinch strikes, and Dolidze was eventually able to just keep pressuring and eventually land a nuke of a right hand that just completely knocked Souza out cold. I mean, Dolidze definitely has some massive power in his hands, but he just doesn't throw his strikes that much. And Dolidze's last fight was actually a spinning back fist knockout too, so it's definitely proven that he has great power in his strikes, and Ibragimov, I think, lacks a lot of power in his strikes. We know what to expect from Ibragimov too. He's done the same thing in both UFC fights. He comes out, looks for an early knockout, swarms you with sloppy punch combinations, and then gasses out. That's what happened in both of his fights. He did make it to the decision and didn't look completely helpless versus Ed Herman. I think he actually might have won at round 3 versus Ed Herman, but in the Da Un Jung fight, he looked helpless. He was struggling to even stay on his feet in round 2 and eventually got tapped out with a really weird guillotine in round 3. One big concern about this fight is Dolidze has not fought in 18 months, and he is coming off of a PED suspension. USADA did catch him for some form of PEDs about a year or two ago, and this could be his first fight in MMA not on steroids, so that's definitely a factor to look out for here. If I had to bet, I would bet that he would still be on steroids. He probably just found a way around the USADA system, but Dolidze is 6-0, and likely all 6 of those fights he was on steroids. He gets popped, and now he's fighting again. So there's a chance that he might look flat here. He might look terrible coming off the layoff, and that's why I think that you can't bet Dolidze at too much of a favorite. I wouldn't really bet Dolidze at all at this price, because even though I think he should be minus 200, I think that he's going to have to withstand that early storm from Ibragimov. He could easily get slept in the first 60 seconds by that crazy onslaught of punches from Ibragimov. And the PED suspension and the layoff is a big concern. There's also a striking volume concern here from Dolidze. If the fight somehow ends up taking place at kickboxing range, I think that Dolidze's volume is very low, and he could possibly lose rounds by just being too inactive on the feet. So I obviously favor Dolidze. I think he probably hits calf kicks, he outboxes Ibragimov, probably even hits takedowns and outgrapples him at points too. But in round 1, they could just bang it out on the feet, and it could be a coin flip when those crazy exchanges that Ibragimov loves to get into. So I would like to say dog or pass for this one because I'm not advising betting on the favorite, but I think that there's no value on Ibragimov at plus 137 at all. If you want to bet Ibragimov, probably do it by round 1 knockout. This is a hard fight to bet because I think the winner of the fight is unbettable and the loser of the fight has no value. So this is probably going to be a pass for me in terms of the money line, but the pick is going to be Dolidze by decision. The next fight is the first fight on the main card in the flyweight division. We have Alvarez-Pantoja taking on Askarov. The opening betting line for this one was Pantoja minus 180 to Askarov plus 155. Right now we are seeing Pantoja minus 185 to Askarov plus 170. There is two-way action coming in on this fight. It's a great fight. I understand why. Super competitive. And I think it's probably dog or pass, honestly. And the reason why I say that is because of the way that Pantoja looked in his last fight. And Pantoja's been a guy who's been notoriously durable, was eating some massive punches and elbows from Figueiredo and just staying on his feet, kept moving forward. But in his last fight versus Matt Schnell, he looked a little bit chinny. He got rocked with some punches and, did the stanky leg a little bit and definitely looked to not have his feet under him at certain points. So that was kind of an uncharacteristic game plan from Pantoja as well. He's always had good striking, really nice boxing, but he just came out of the gate and went right after Schnell, was throwing massive combinations and getting in wild pocket exchanges, and that's not really like him. I mean, the guy is usually a jabber, and he likes to go for takedowns and back takes. He's a tremendous grappler as well, but Pantoja fought a little uncharacteristic in his last fight. Now, getting over to Askarov, much less UFC experience, but I've been pretty impressed with what I've seen from him. He did lose the fight to Marino, although it was technically scored a draw. He definitely lost that fight, in my opinion. And Askarov looked pretty good in his last fight against Tim Elliott as well. He rocked Elliott in round 1 with a punch and was able to outgrapple him for the rest of that round. Had a closer round 2. He got taken down with some judo throws in the clinch and spent some time on his back, but came back in round 3 and outstruck Elliott. But Elliott wasn't really throwing much volume back at Askarov throughout that fight, and it wasn't the greatest win from Askarov. On the feet in this one, I think that Pantoja is the much more technical striker and probably has the more power too, but I think that Askarov has some sneaky striking of his own and could give Pantoja some problems on the feet, especially with how lackadaisical Pantoja's defense looked last fight. And in the grappling aspect of things, I think that Askarov is the much more likely one to hit takedowns here and to attempt them. Pantoja's takedown defense and defensive grappling should be good enough to avoid getting taken down and outgrappled here. Marino had a lot of success defending the takedowns of Askarov and was able to avoid the takedowns and land the better strikes in the feet to win that fight. So I think that that's a pretty similar game plan from what Pantoja needs to do here. He needs to stuff takedowns, land the more meaningful strikes, and likely outstrike Askarov here. I don't think that we'll see either of them outgrapple each other. They're both tremendous grapplers and would be pretty shocked to see them outgrapple each other, although they are both prolific back takers. They love going for those rear naked chokes, so we might see a back take and a crazy scramble or transition or something, so look out for that. I do think the fight is dog or pass at this point. I think with the way that Pantoja looked in his last fight, you just can't be trusting him at minus 200 against another solid, well-rounded flyweight like Askarov. And in terms of a bet for this fight, I looked at the props, and if you have access to this prop, the fight ends by knockout prop. It could either end by knockout, submission, or decision. Fight ends by knockout was plus 370 when I bet it for a half a unit. And I think that the reasoning behind that bet is the way that Pantoja came out aggressive in round 1 versus Schnell. Didn't seem to have the best boxing defense himself in those exchanges. I haven't been too impressed with Askarov's boxing defense either, and Askarov did drop Tim Elliott in round 1 of their fight, so I think that there's power on both ends here. I think both of their boxing defenses are a little lackadaisical, and we could see them just swing it out and possibly knock each other out here. So I'm playing fight ends by knockout plus 370 for half a unit. In terms of the money line here, I think it's dog or pass. I have not locked in any action on Askarov here because I ultimately do think Pantoja wins the fight. Even though I'm betting fight ends by knockout, I honestly do think the fight goes to the decision, and we likely see Pantoja land the more meaningful strikes, maybe get some dominant positions on the ground, and win a decision here. So, dog or pass, there's some small value on Askarov, and the official prediction is going to be Pantoja by decision. The next fight takes place in the women's flyweight division. We have Ariane Lipski taking on Luana-Carolina. The opening betting line for this one was Lipski minus 125, Carolina minus 105. Right now we are seeing Lipski minus 112 to Carolina plus 102. So two-way action coming in on this fight. People are betting both sides. This is a really low-level fight. I understand throwing some fun money on this one, maybe one unit on either side, but if you're seriously betting this fight with multiple units and you have extreme confidence in one of these ladies, I'm telling you, you're doing it wrong because we have 3 UFC cards this week. That means we have about 35 different fights taking place throughout the week. There are so many more better fighters and better matchups to be betting on than this low-level women's fight, and I just think that if you're betting a lot of money, multiple units on this fight, you're just approaching MMA betting with a bad strategy that's not good for long term. So even if one of these women wins convincingly, wins by first round finish or something like that, I don't think it's a great bet at a high clip over time. So getting it down to breaking down the fight, Carolina, I think, is the more proven striker because we've seen her strike for 15 minutes in her last fight versus Cachoeira. Cachoeira is a terrible opponent with no defense, so Carolina did look pretty good teeing off on her, but I think if Lipski fought her, she would look the same. I think we haven't seen Lipski's striking look that good in the UFC. In her pre-UFC fights, she was like knocking chicks out with head kicks, but that just hasn't really came to fruition in the UFC. She did get an early knockdown over DePauda in her last fight, but that fight versus DePauda was a very concerning fight because Lipski was largely winning that fight by a wide margin, but still managed to look really bad at certain points. Like, she dropped DePauda in round 1, was on top for half the round, then got reversed and spent half the round on her back. She spent 2.5 minutes on her back, didn't really seem to have much ability to get up at all. Then she hits a takedown in round 2, or actually she reversed the takedown in round 2, and was on top for about 4.5 minutes. But then she gives up her arm in a weird grappling exchange and almost gets armbarred at the end of round 2. Then round 3 starts and she gets double-legged and stuck on her back for about 2.5 minutes. And then she eventually used a nice half-guard sweep to end up on top, but that was versus a gassed DePauda in round 3. So Lipski spent about 5 minutes on her back versus a really, really low-level fighter in DePauda. And I just think that was a terrible sign from Lipski because that means that she could get a kick caught and put on her back and might not get up. She could get a weak takedown or a clinch takedown of some sort, fall on her back and not get up. And you just can't be betting a lot of money on a fighter who has almost no ability to get off of her back. We haven't really seen the Carolina's defensive grappling tested too much. She did stuff some takedowns versus Lima on the Contender Series. But I think the Carolina's grappling looked pretty bad too versus Cachoeira. She went for some questionable submissions, and she was going for triangles and arm bars off of her back, but I don't think the Carolina is a very positionally sound grappler at all. So I think this one predominantly plays out on the feet. We're going to see some even striking exchanges between the two. I think Lipski has a technique and power advantage while Carolina has a volume advantage. So I think Lipski's going to be landing the cleaner, harder strikes while Carolina is just going to be throwing out a lot of volume. And if Carolina wants to win this fight, I think that she's going to need to mix in the clinch where she can land those knees and elbows, use her longer frame to outstrike Lipski, and possibly look to exploit that terrible takedown defense and get up of Lipski as well. Maybe even look to hit her own takedown or catch a kick and put Lipski on her back. So I was initially leaning Lipski pre-tape here, but with how bad that she looked versus DePauda and the fact that she could get a kick caught or a weak takedown and lose the fight completely, I think that it's dog or pass. I think that there's really not much value on either line here. I think that if you want to throw one unit on either side, pick your side, but do not go crazy betting on this fight. It's a super low level, high variance fight, and the official pick is probably going to be Lipski by decision. As I mentioned, I think she lands the cleaner, harder strikes throughout the 15 minutes. But it's not a confident pick at all, and I would not bet on this fight very heavily. The next fight takes place in the lightweight division. We have Mark Diakese taking on Rafael Fiziev. The opening betting line for this one was Diakese the favorite at minus 230 to Fiziev plus 195. Right now we are seeing Mark Diakese minus 147 to Fiziev plus 137. So line margins tightening up. A lot more action coming in on Fiziev as the dog. I agree with that action. I think that especially at plus 195, Fiziev was a tremendous bet. If anybody got in on that, you got a lot of value. And even at plus 137, I think that there's still some value left on Fiziev. Now, Diakese was on a 3-fight losing streak, not looking too good, going up and down between weight classes, but then eventually got back on track, beating Joe Duffy and beating Lando Venata. But you got to look at those two wins very closely because I mentioned the Duffy fight earlier in the podcast. Duffy looked to give up very early in that fight and provided very little resistance throughout that at all. Barely threw any strikes, couldn't stop takedowns, couldn't get off his back. And then versus Lando Venata, Venata is not a pressure fighter. He's a guy who wants to stay at range and throw kicks at you, does not have the best fight IQ at times, definitely doesn't have the best round winning style. And Diakese was able to outstrike him, but he was able to move forward and outstrike him. So when Diakese is pressuring and he's the one leading and controlling the action, he's a good striker. He's got great calf kicks, decent boxing, even ability to hit offensive takedowns. But when you put Diakese on the back foot is when he really struggles. That's how Nasrat Haqparast was able to outstrike him. A few of other opponents have been able to do the same, and I think that that's what Fiziev does really well. This is a really close striking match between the two. I think I give Diakese a kicking advantage. He's the better overall kicker, but I think Fiziev is the better boxer and has better punches. So we're going to see Diakese to look to keep the range, move backwards, use his jab and his front kick and his length, while Fiziev is going to look to get into the pocket, land punches, chop down the legs of Diakese. And I think that the leg kick is a huge tool for Fiziev here because Diakese has not done well stuffing or checking leg kicks throughout his career. And I think that if you were able to limit Diakese's movement and you get him moving backwards, I think it would be actually pretty easy for Fiziev to outstrike him here. So I think that where the line is at now, there is value on Fiziev, and I've seen good enough takedown defense from Rafael Fiziev to think that he stuffs Diakese's takedowns. I think Fiziev stuffed 11 of 11 takedowns versus Alex White in his last fight. White not the greatest grappler, but it was still impressive to see that Fiziev is constantly improving his takedown defense, considering he comes from a kickboxing Muay Thai background. So I give Fiziev a striking advantage in this one, actually, because I think he's going to be the one pressuring. He's going to be marching forward more, throwing leg kicks, landing the better punches, while Diakese is going to have to fight off the back foot, which he's not very good at. So maybe Fiziev doesn't pressure, doesn't implement the right game plan, and loses a striking fight here. But I think what I've seen from Fiziev, he's aggressive enough where I think we can trust him to come forward, throw leg kicks, land punches, stuff takedowns, and probably land some good clinch strikes too. I think he's probably the better clinch striker, considering he comes from a Muay Thai background, and I've seen some good knees and elbows in the clinch from him as well. So I'm going to favor and pick Fiziev in this one. I think that he wins this fight by decision or knockout, and I'm actually pretty confident in Fiziev here. So it's dog or pass all day. I think that Fiziev is worth a bet at plus 137. I have one unit on him at plus 140. And wouldn't actually mind going 2-3 units on Fiziev here because I'm very confident in Fiziev. And Diakese being the favorite here is kind of inflated based on his past 2 wins, which I think were just very good matchups for him. And I do not think that Fiziev is going to be nearly as easy of a matchup. So the pick here is going to be Fiziev by decision, and I will be betting him at plus 140. The next fight is the co-main event of the evening in the middleweight division. We have Jack Hermansson taking on Kelvin Gastelum. The opening betting line for this one was Gastelum minus 150 to Hermansson plus 130. Right now we are seeing a pick'em at minus 105 for both fighters. So there is two-way action coming in on this fight. Definitely more action on the dog Hermansson, considering Gastelum opened minus 150. He's now minus 105. It goes without saying that more action came in on Hermansson, but there's two-way action coming in on this fight. Hermansson was jumping up to plus 100, back down to a favorite, so a lot of action coming in on this fight. And where the betting line is at now, I think it's clear that Jack Hermansson is the value side. I mean, we have a guy who is the much more active guy. He attempts takedowns, goes for submissions, is a pretty active striker on the feet. And then you have Kelvin Gastelum, who is a low output counter striker, who doesn't really lead that much, attempts an occasional takedown, doesn't have the greatest takedown defense. I mean, I actually don't like Kelvin Gastelum at all. I think he's one of the most disliked fighters on the UFC roster, and it's honestly very warranted just because of how low level his skill is. Most of his wins have come over past prime heavyweights, or middleweights. I think I saw a statistic that said that Kelvin Gastelum has never knocked out an opponent that was less than 10 years older than him. So all of his knockouts, Bisping, Kennedy, Vitor, they're all over old past prime fighters. So I think that Kelvin Gastelum as a fighter has been massively overrated throughout his career. And in his last fight versus Darren Till, he looked awful. I mean, he barely threw anything. He landed like 30 strikes throughout the fight, was scared to pull the trigger, was getting outstruck in the clinch, pushed against the cage. I mean, it was just a terrible performance from Gastelum. And Hermansson actually had a pretty bad performance from him in his last fight too. He fought Jared Cannonier. He was shooting some pretty bad takedowns, getting his takedown stuffed, getting outstruck, leg kicked, and eventually got rocked with an uppercut and TKO'd about 5 or 6 minutes into that fight. So Hermansson was definitely trying to grapple in that fight versus Cannonier. Cannonier has a great base, great takedown defense, punished him with hard strikes, and was able to TKO him. Now, getting down to how these two match up, I think that Hermansson is pretty reliable to come forward, throw volume, and to likely attempt takedowns. He has attempted a lot of takedowns in his most recent fights, and with the takedown defense that I've seen from Kelvin Gastelum, he got taken down by Chris Weidman fairly easily. He got taken down by Jacare Souza with a single leg. So I'm pretty confident in the fact that Hermansson will attempt and hit takedowns here versus Kelvin. Now, he doesn't have the greatest top control. He's really at his best when he's throwing ground and pound, but he tends to go for some risky submissions. He loves that arm and guillotine, that head and arm guillotine that he goes for on a lot of his opponents. And that's not the most reliable submission, because if it does not work, then you end up on your back, which is not what you really want in MMA. But I think that there will be enough of a grappling differential here that we won't really have to be worried about Hermansson getting stuck on his back. I don't think that that's very likely at all. If he fails a guillotine or something like that, he probably works his way back up to the feet immediately. I really think that there is one way for Kelvin Gastelum to win this fight, and that is by knockout. I don't think that he has the volume to win a decision. Maybe he lands knockdowns in multiple rounds and steals 2 out of 3 rounds and beats Hermansson via decision. It's certainly unlikely to see Gastelum submit Hermansson here, so I really do think that the only way Kelvin Gastelum wins is by knockout. And he's also going to have to stuff takedowns and get off of his back to win by knockout too, because Hermansson almost immediately attempts takedowns in all of his fights. So we're going to either have to see Gastelum counter and try to hurt Hermansson right away within the first 30 seconds, or I think he's probably going to be in for a long night, gets taken down, out-grappled, and likely submitted at some point too. So at this betting line right now, I think that there is a lot of value on Jack Hermansson. I think that I would actually start to favor Hermansson at more of -150. I think he has just so many more ways to win the fight. He could win by ground and pound TKO, he could win by submission, and he could win by decision as well. I don't think it's very likely that we see Hermansson outstrike Gastelum on the feet. But with how bad Kelvin looked in his last fight, and with how scared he looked to throw punches and how low volume he was, it wouldn't completely surprise me to see Hermansson just leg kick and throw a ton of jabs and somehow outstrike Kelvin Gastelum at distance here. So I favor Hermansson closer to -150, -200 range even. I think that I bet him for 2 units at +100. Even at -105, I think there's a lot of value on Hermansson left. Also, the +600 submission prop has some value too. So the official prediction for me is going to be Hermansson by decision. I think he gets those early takedowns, probably wears on Gastelum with his top game, and eventually gets a submission, maybe even a TKO too. So the pick is Hermansson by finish. In the main event of the evening for the vacant UFC Flyweight Championship, we have Deiveson Figueiredo taking on Joseph Benavidez. The opening betting line for this one was Figueiredo -150 to Benavidez +130. Right now we are seeing Figueiredo -215 to Benavidez +195. So this is, of course, the rematch from the fight this February. It was only about 4 or 5 months ago. February 29th, 2020 is when the first fight took place. And to put in some perspective here, the first fight opened as Benavidez as a -165 favorite to Figueiredo +135, and ended up closing at Benavidez -160, Figueiredo +140. Now Figueiredo has gone from the underdog to the pretty sizable favorite at -215. He, of course, won the first fight by second round knockout, but I think that when you look at how the first fight went, how close of a fight it was, I think that where the current line is at is actually wide. I think that people are maybe seeing that Figueiredo won the first fight and thinking he'll easily win this fight too, but that first fight was very close. A lot of people aren't remembering that because Figueiredo won by knockout and people think it's a convincing, definitive outcome, but I do not think that that's the case. I think round 1 was very close. I actually gave the round to Joe Benavidez despite Figueiredo landing some big punches and having a close armbar attempt. And then in round 2, of course, the headbutt happened. Joe B got a little distracted, started touching the cut, and next thing you know, Figueiredo lands a massive right hand, knocks Joe B down, and finishes up with some ground and pound for a TKO in round 2. So it was a nasty knockout, devastating punch that he landed, but it was definitely influenced by the headbutt. And if you look at that fight without the headbutt, how does the fight go? I think that Joe Benavidez was winning the majority of the striking exchanges. He was landing big punches on Figueiredo, but his punches seem to have very little effect on Figueiredo. Figueiredo is so durable that even these big counter hooks that were winging from Joe Benavidez's hip just weren't hurting him, which is a huge concern because if you're Joe Benavidez and you're landing these flush punches, these hooks and big combinations, and Figueiredo isn't taking a step backwards, you realize that you're fighting an insanely durable human being, and I think that Figueiredo could be too durable to even get hurt by Joe Benavidez's strikes. It honestly looked like he was taking punches from a fighter a weight class below him when they were fighting the first time. So getting down to the rematch, it's really on Joe Benavidez to adapt because he's the much more versatile fighter. He's the one who can incorporate more kicks or more offensive wrestling or a different style, while Figueiredo is pretty much going to fight the same style because it worked for him the first time. He's a low volume counter puncher who swings massive power punches, and that worked out very well for him. He was cutting off the cage, wasn't throwing much volume, just keeping an eye on his defense and counter punching and landing hard strikes versus Joe B. But if we're being honest, the headbutt massively influenced the outcome of that fight. If the headbutt hadn't happened, Figueiredo probably wouldn't have landed that right hand. I mean, the fight might have kept going, and he might have eventually counterstruck him and landed that knockout blow, but you have to acknowledge that the headbutt had a massive influence on the official outcome of the fight. And if the headbutt hadn't happened, we might have seen Joe B taken in the later rounds where he likely has the better cardio and outstrike, possibly win the decision, get a late finish. So the fight could have happened a lot of different ways, and I'm actually kind of glad we're getting to see a rematch, even though I'm very scared as a fan of Joe Benavidez. I think that there's a great chance that he gets knocked dead again. And I mean, the first fight was only about 5 or 6 months ago, and I don't know if he's fully recovered from the massive amount of damage he took from that finish. So it is Joseph Benavidez's responsibility to adapt to this second fight. We know that Figueiredo is likely going to come in with the same game plan, the same style, and it's going to be on Joe B to switch up his game plan, to maybe incorporate more kicks, to maybe avoid getting in pocket exchanges, to maybe look to offensive wrestle more. But to be honest, from the way that Figueiredo stuffed Benavidez's takedowns in the first fight, I don't think that Benavidez has much success taking him down. And we've only seen Figueiredo outgrappled by 2 people, Jared Brooks and Jussier Formiga. And I just don't think that we can really rely on Benavidez hitting takedowns and getting top position, because Fig's defensive grappling is constantly improving. He got outgrappled by Formiga, looked to work on that defensive grappling, his get-ups, his takedown defense a lot. And then in his next fight versus Pantoja, he showed massive defensive grappling improvements. So I think that Figueiredo's takedown defense, his defensive grappling, has improved to the point where we can rely on him to stuff takedowns, which means the fight is going to be taking place in the striking. And there you just have to favor Figueiredo. I just can't see any way that Benavidez fights where he isn't at risk for getting counterpunched and getting hit with massive punches from Fig. No way that Benavidez has fought in the past few years has been safe. He constantly dips his head in. He doesn't have the best defense of his own. And I just don't think that that style is very good for him late into his career. I think that especially it's not good when you're fighting one of the most devastating counterpunches that has ever fought in the UFC in Figueiredo. So sadly, I'm going to be picking Figueiredo in this one. I think that the fight lasts a little bit longer than it did the last time. It probably goes in around 3 or 4 before Figueiredo gets the finish. And in terms of a bet in this one, the money lines have not much value to me. I do think there is small value on Benavidez at this plus 180, 190 price. I just think that the way the first fight went, it was close enough to where Benavidez could realistically adapt, make this fight different, and win the fight, get his flyweight championship. But as a Joe Benavidez fan, I don't have much hope. Could be preparing for the worst here, but I do think that Benavidez gets knocked out again here. So in terms of a bet in this one, I think that the inside the distance, the fight does not go the decision at minus 200 is still value, because Benavidez fights in such an aggressive way that he likely either gets an early finish or gets finished himself. So the moneyline aspect of things, it's dog or pass. There is some small value on Benavidez, but in terms of a pure pick, I'm going to have to go with Deiveson Figueiredo to win the flyweight championship by knockout in round 3. So that is going to do it for this episode of the Martian MMA podcast. Thank you all for listening throughout this busy UFC week. 3 UFCs in 1 week. That means 3 podcasts in 1 week. So if you've listened to all 3, I tremendously appreciate you. And we will be back next week before the next UFC event, which I believe is Till versus Whitaker. So I will recap my final bets on my Bet MMA tips page. That's where you can find all of my official bets for the evening. And that is going to do it for the podcast. So I hope you all enjoyed. Thank you all for listening, and I will see you next week. Peace.